You are listening to Science Coast with Mallory Havens and
Chris White.
And our return guest,
Brother James Gaffney.
Welcome back.
Thank you.
For this podcast, we'd like to talk about the excellence of Chicago. So I didn't grow up in the city, but I grew up around the city. I married somebody from the city. And to be very sincere, I firmly believe that Chicago is one of the greatest cities in the world.
Uh-huh.
And I think Brother James agrees with me on this.
You know, it's interesting that for 7 years in a row now, it might be 5, but I think it's 7, Chicago has received the distinction as the best large city in the United States and the most authentic, typical all-American city as well.
Oh,
And
interesting.
who did that? Well, I did actually name that. No, wasn't I?
It's an award I give.
It actually is a publication that solicits opinions from tourists throughout the world. What cities to go to, what destinations, and why. And so that's quite remarkable. I remember once I'm on the board of trustees for St. Mary's College of California in San Francisco area. So I was going out for a board meeting. I was in the seat in the aisle, and right across the aisle was a woman, maybe in her 60s or so. I mean, she was talking about her experience in Chicago and heading back. She's from San Francisco. So I could just overhear the conversation a little bit. The gentleman next to her, and they hit it off well in conversation. So he said, well, why did you come to Chicago? She said, well, I always heard about the architecture.
Oh, yeah.
And I wanted to experience it while I'm still healthy. And, of course, it's just extraordinary, and it's absolutely beautiful and stunning. And the place where the skyscraper first was constructed. And so she said, one thing, he asked the question, what amazed you most besides the architecture of the lake, the lakefront, 26 miles of parks and so forth, just splendid. She said, well, it's so clean.
Oh.
She said, I lived in New York, and now I'm in San Francisco. And I had always heard that Chicago's a clean city, but that was one of the things I was stunned by. And she said, then in going back, I'm saying to myself, San Francisco is a really dirty place. It really needs it. And unfortunately, it's struggling now in many ways, although it's still vibrant. Economically, it's still vibrant and a place where tourists go. But that was her comment above all, besides the stunning beauty of the architecture and the lakefront in the neighborhoods, was the fact that it was such a clean city.
I think the decision to protect the lakefront had a huge role in this.
Absolutely.
So that, for those who aren't aware, it's not legal to actually build within a certain distance of the lakefront. And the lakefront is reserved for the public. And one of the things that I really enjoy to do is take my bike into the city.
Yes.
And just ride up and down the lakefront. You can ride all the way up to Loyola University. Good Jesuit institution.
Well, no, not that. Oh, no, yes, you're right. It is.
and then take the trail all the way south, and you can find your way all the way to the Illinois-Indiana border.
That's it. You've done it.
And
Absolutely.
it's just really, and you can stop and see all of the sites that were in the Blues Brothers movies, the bridge.
Coupled with, it continues to be the number one tour, the tour of the river with the docents. The magnificence of the architecture. If you haven't been in Chicago, say for a 3-year period, you won't recognize all the new buildings that are constructed, and they're stunning in their beauty. But each year there's a vote for that category of tours of cities, especially boat tours. And Chicago has consistently been the number one tour in the United States.
So, brother, you grew up in Chicago, is that correct?
I did, on the west side of the city.
And what do you remember from your childhood?
That I didn't know there was a south side or a north side. No, that's not true. Well, it was a very mixed neighborhood, and that was very fine. I was so pleased by that. There were Italian people and Jewish people and Irish people and German people, and African American people, and some Latino as well. So that was wholesome and enriching and just filled out one's experience of the diversity of Chicago or other great cities in the United States. So we had the parish school in the neighborhood. We had, within 10 blocks, we probably had 5 parish schools that I could have chosen. I chose the one that my parents chose. That made sense, and that they had been students at it as well.
So did the parishes in your neighborhood have festivals throughout the summer, and what were those like, and how were they different between the parishes?
Not so much, actually. You mean like ethnic festivals as an example? Yes, they would have those. This was a concentration. These were an Italian neighborhood. And so, yes, they would have 3 or 4 or 5 parishes come together and provide that. There'd also be religious events, like, for instance, the nurses would march down Jackson Boulevard from the far west of the city until about the middle of the city, and then it was a big ritual and a basilica parish and so forth. Hundreds of thousands would come out for that one. We think now of the St. Patrick's parades, and there's 4 or 5 or 6 of those, including a big one downtown, and of course the Christmas parades. Well, this was one. And so there are a number of religious festivals as well that blended culture and religion and neighborhood identity, really.
One thing that surprised me that I learned about Chicago is all of the buildings in the loop are connected underground in a tunnel system.
Yes, it's not all the buildings, but it's many. And so that is, there are tours now that are given to tourists coming to Chicago to see that. And so, and yes, over here, this is the entrance to Macy's, and over there, oh, that's City Hall, and oh, that's the county building, and this is, and so forth. So that's true. And even beneath that, there were tunnels, as it were. You could walk through the tunnel. It would be delivering coal to these various buildings back in the 1800s, late 1800s or so. But then this other pathway you're talking about was just because Chicago can have harsh winters, of course.
Right.
This was not one of them this past year. So it was just terrific to be able to walk safely, not in the rain, not in the cold, and so forth, for blocks and blocks and blocks. Yes.
Yeah.
I think a lot of that is also to separate out pedestrian and civilian life from commercial. So they built tunnel systems, and a lot of commercial activity happened below street level so that it wouldn't interfere in some sense with traffic and pedestrians. And so you're commenting, brother, about the coal coming in. And I think there were a lot of shipments. You know, they would, like, if you go to Wacker Drive, there's Upper Wacker Drive and there's Lower Wacker Drive. And it's almost approaching a 3-dimensional city where you have layer on top of layer on top of layer. And current street level downtown is so much higher than it was originally.
True.
Because the original street level was basically at the level of the river and the level of the lake. And now it's probably 2-3 stories higher than that. And so if you go down,
raised for that reason.
And if you go down to Lower Wacker Drive, and it's like, oh wow, look, this building actually has a front entrance that's below street level, because it was at one time the original entrance to the building.
Why didn't they change it?
Well, the original change was done for, sorry to say it this way, sewage reasons, water flow. So if your building is basically at the water table level, then it's really hard to get water to go where you want it to go. And so there was at some point, I think in the 1800s, there was a decision made to actually raise the entire city up so that then they could have the pipes below the buildings but above the water table so that the water would flow through the pipes to where they wanted it to go. And then it just kept going.
Remember about 20 years ago, there was the flooding that happened downtown.
That was more than 20 years ago, brother.
Was it okay? Well, all right, 112 years ago. But yes, unfortunately, it hit a lower level, and that admitted the water from the river and the lake in the river throughout all these buildings that were
Through the tunnel system.
Through the tunnels.
Right?
Yeah, they punched it.
And they had about 1 million people who had to leave the city within an hour, at least the downtown area, as a emergency intervention to try to restore safety and so forth. DePaul University has, I think, 7 or 8 buildings downtown, and all of those buildings were flooded. They were not back in class for about a month or so.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, they were the pioneers in online education suddenly. So, yes, that's true.
Yeah, it was unfortunate. I think some of the very older tunnels were not marked appropriately, and so they were putting in pilings. They were drilling to put pilings into the river, and they drilled down and punctured the roof of one of these tunnels. And for a while, they didn't even know what was going on. They were trying to figure out, why is the city flooding?
Yes, why is it floating?
I definitely read about that in some book, but I don't remember
it was
what year it was.
before you were born, Mallory.
It might well have been. Right? Exactly.
So 112 years ago.
Yes, approximately. Yes, exactly. But there's so many marvelous facilities downtown with all the museums, of course, the Spectacular, the Art Institute in particular.
I think the restaurants are my favorite.
Restaurants
There's such an amazing variety.
Parkways, definitely that. Architecture, sculpture. Chicago, of all the English-speaking major cities in the world, Chicago, I think, is number 3 in theater. It's New York City, it's London, it's Chicago, and it's Toronto. At one point before, at least COVID, there were about 226 theaters in Chicago. Now, some are about the size of this room, and others are 4,000, 5,000 or so patrons. So that has always been a major feature of the city.
One thing I'd say as a person who did not grow up in Chicago or the Chicago area, when I was initially moving to this area, I was a little intimidated by being by a big city because I grew up, on 18 acres, like pretty on a dirt road. Like I was half a mile to the first paved road. And not that I was a total bumpkin, just a partial bumpkin. But
yeah, you're kind of beyond that. Congratulations.
Thank you. Well, you can't always get all the bumpkin out. But I think it made a difference coming to Chicago as the first big city that I lived in the area of, because it is very friendly and Midwestern. And people are nice and it's easy to navigate, and it just was more welcoming. I've been to New York. I've been to other major cities, and it did not have that welcoming vibe.
Chicago has been identified as the city that is most accessible downtown. You can walk to almost everything or bicycle to everything, which is really a big asset.
For sure. And it's nice, too, that the train is elevated, so you can just walk
and
under
subway,
it.
both,
Yes,
exactly. And most neighborhoods, second only to New York, really, in its comprehensiveness.
Mm-hmm.
I have an interesting story that's like complementary to your story, Mallory, about how you came from the Chicago being this really big city. For about 10 years, I was doing a lot of work in China, and I would spend a lot of time in Beijing and Hong Kong, Shanghai. And so I remember but I was working in the city in this institution in Bronzeville, and came back from China after having been there for some time. Went home from the airport, next morning woke up, got on the train, got off at Union Station, and was walking through the downtown area. And compared to Beijing and Hong Kong and Shanghai, my thought was, oh, how quaint. This is such a dainty little city with narrow streets. And one of my Chinese colleagues came for a conference in the city, and after having spent about 4 or 5 days walking through Grant Park and everywhere through the city, she looked at me one day at dinner time and she goes, "Where is everybody?" Because the population density for her, she was a resident of Beijing, was so much higher than the population density of Chicago. And I think that's another thing we need to realize is we have all of these amenities. We have this amazing restaurant scene. We have theater. We have parks. We have amazing architecture, but it's livable.
Exactly.
It's accessible, and you're not overwhelmed. And so for the bumpkins in all of us, sometimes it can be a little bit overwhelming, but at the same time, it's not actually overwhelming by international standards at all.
Right.
Although Chicago right now is the fastest growing downtown in the United States.
That makes sense, especially because I think that traditionally the loop would kind of close with businesses and people going back, and now there's been the reverse migration back into the city, and more and more people are starting to live there.
A lot of young adults, a lot of Midwestern universities, Big Ten universities, Chicago, Northwestern, Loyola, and so forth. Their graduates want to be there. That's very true.
Yeah, I had an apartment in the South Loop for 3 years when I was working in the city, and I can tell you it was just glorious. It really was. The idea that I could ride my bicycle to my office every day. If it was raining, I could take public transportation. I could walk to, various places to listen to live music. I could go hang out in the summertime. I loved hanging out at Buckingham Fountain and watching all the tourists as the lights would come on. It's the closest you get to Disney because they actually have a choreographed, fountain display with lights and music with the speakers hidden in the bushes around Buckingham Fountain, and to see the city as the sun goes down with the lake on one side.
The Merchandise Mart now, which is the whole facade, is
it's just
brilliantly
gorgeous.
illuminated. Absolutely, and the neighborhoods like, for instance, the Fulton Market area. That's the hottest market in the United States right now for homes, for condominiums, for new office buildings, restaurants for gloriously arrayed and so forth. So it is marvelous. There are challenges of not enough affordable housing. That's an issue. Too much of a segregated city that to be worked at, and I think a lot of good intentions are directed in that way. Trying to maintain quality public schools. There's still a good parochial school system, but public schools. But 11 of the 12 best-rated high schools in the state of Illinois are in the city of Chicago.
Oh, public schools?
Public schools, 11 of the 12. The only one that isn't is in that category is one of the Northwest suburban ones that is peer to places like Walter Payton, as an example, or Northside Prep and so forth. Those are superb. And then you have a number of the Italian high schools, you have Jesuit high schools, and so forth. So it's served well. Crime, of course, is an issue. Carjacking is one. Street crime is another. But that's and the whole city has to come together, and I think that is happening. Business people, government, police, and so forth to address it. The whole complexity of mental health issues and poverty and lack of education and affordable housing and so forth and so forth. But I think we'll see more progress, considerably more in the next 5 or 6 years in that regard. And Chicago is not in the top 20 for crime in the United States. It's not.
Also, on a per capita basis, I think it's really important to mention that there, you see lots of stories about crime, but it's also true that there are millions of people who live in the city. So if you actually calculate what the rate is per capita, it actually is lower in the city of Chicago than it is in many rural counties. That the per capita crime rate in Chicago, I'll say it one more time, is lower than the crime rate in rural counties in the state of Illinois.
Agreed.
The only time I've had my car broken into was not in Chicago. It was in a different city.
Oh, good. Don't tell me it was Lewis University campus.
It was not. No. It was a different state even.
Okay, Brother James, as we get close to the end here, if you were to give advice to somebody who's never been to Chicago, what would you say they should be thinking about or focusing on if they were going to spend a weekend in the city? What would you want them to look at and go explore?
Well, you do the tour of the river, absolutely that. The Chicago Architectural Society has a couple wonderful walking tours downtown. I've done several of those, as well as the buses, of course, that with upper level, so you can see the skyscrapers at a different level than just walking. That would be very important. Select some quality restaurants, a variety of cuisines, that for sure. The architecture, the Architectural Society has tours of some of the great churches constructed a century and a half ago, as an example. Definitely the Art Institute, unless the weather is so glorious. I've gone over to Campus Park, where all the Arboretum, not the Arboretum, but the aquarium is over there, and Field Museum is over there, and the planetarium is over there. So do all that if you can. Concerts for sure. Take in a couple of those. Maybe a sporting event. Wrigley Field is a must, for sure. And maybe if the White Sox get a new stadium, that'll be a must as well. So,
but the White Sox are a better team.
Yeah, whatever.
I don't know if they're better in athleticism. I just like them better.
Yes, I hope they can be sustained in Chicago. It's a wonderful asset. So yes, all that, and I think a person would be well served and want to come back again.
Sounds like more than a weekend worth of
It
stuff.
It does, absolutely.
And with that, the views, thoughts, and opinions expressed are the speaker's own and do not represent the views, thoughts, and opinions of Lewis University. The material and information presented here is for general information purposes only. The Lewis University name and all forms and abbreviations are the property of its owner, and its use does not imply endorsement of or opposition to any specific organization, product, or service. This podcast was produced in the WLRA podcast studios at Lewis University. Visit lewisu.edu for more information about Lewis University. This has been Science Coast with Mallory Havens and
Chris White
and
Brother James Gaffney.
Thanks for listening.
Thank you.